The warning had existed for 11,000 years. It sat in the Conclave's central archive on the station called Vel-Soreth, a massive, slowly rotating ring of pale stone and crystallized memory lattice that orbited no star in particular, choosing instead to drift in the quiet dark between systems like an old librarian who had given up on finding a comfortable chair. The warning was not filed under threats. It was not filed under dangers, or hostile civilizations, or even curious anomalies. It had been filed 11,000 years ago, under a category that most younger Conclave members didn't even know existed anymore. It was filed under inevitable. The archivist who had created that category was named Suveth Karn. She had been a Delvari, one of the tall, slow-breathing species whose bodies were mostly hollow, filled with a network of resonating chambers that hummed faintly when they spoke, like a cathedral making conversation. The Delvari did not experience time the way most species did. They did not feel urgency. They did not feel panic. What they felt instead was a deep, patient certainty, a sense that all things were already written, already done, already finished, and that living was simply the process of watching it all unfold at the agreed-upon speed. Suveth Karn had watched the humans for 47 years before filing her warning. She had watched them through long-range spectral readers, through intercepted signal fragments, through the thin mathematical signatures that every civilization left in the cosmic background radiation, like fingerprints pressed into warm wax before the universe cooled. She had watched them fight each other with extraordinary creativity. She had watched them invent things, discard them, reinvent them differently. She had watched them build systems and then spend enormous energy tearing those systems down, not because the systems failed but because they had grown bored with them. That last part was what made her file the warning under inevitable. Most dangerous civilizations were dangerous because they were hungry. They expanded because their worlds ran dry or their populations swelled past control or their leaders needed conquest to justify their own existence. That kind of danger was manageable. The Conclave had protocols. You could reason with hunger. You could negotiate with need. You could redirect appetite toward less destructive pastures. But humans, as best as Suveth Karn could observe from 11 light-years away across 47 years of careful watching, were not hungry. They were restless. And there was no protocol for restlessness. She filed the warning. She included 340 pages of supporting observation, 3 statistical models, and one final paragraph that she wrote not as an archivist but as something closer to a philosopher standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down. They will come. Not because they need to. Not because we have something they require. They will come because they have already done everything else within reach, and we are next on the list of things they have not yet done. When they arrive, they will not conquer us. Conquest is too simple for what they are. They will do something stranger and harder to recover from. I do not have a word for it. I am not certain one exists. The warning was logged. It was stamped. It was archived. And for 11,000 years nobody read it. The current archivist of Vel-Soreth was a Delvari named Tethasalun, and she had discovered Suveth Karn's warning entirely by accident. She had been reorganizing the inevitable category, which had grown to include 48 entries over the millennia, most of them about stellar events and gravitational drift patterns, when the human entry surfaced. She had read it in one sitting, which for a Delvari meant approximately 6 of what humans called hours, her resonance chambers humming softly in what an outside observer might have mistaken for contentment but was actually a very specific frequency her species produced when experiencing what could only be translated as dread that arrives slowly and stays forever. That had been 3 years ago. Since then, the humans had made first official contact with the Conclave. Since then, they had been given observer status. Since then, they had attended 11 Conclave sessions, asked questions during all 11, been politely asked to stop asking so many questions during 7, and had somehow, in the span of 36 months, become the most talked about civilization in the known galaxy without technically doing anything that violated a single Conclave rule. Tethasalun kept Suveth Karn's warning on her desk now. Not in the archive. On her desk. On a physical reading plate, the old crystallized lattice kind that you had to hold at a slight angle to catch the light properly. She read the last paragraph every morning. I do not have a word for it. I'm not certain one exists. She was beginning to think Suveth Karn had been too optimistic. The human delegation's current representative was a woman named Claire Vasquez. She was 43 years old. She had a background in systems engineering and xenolinguistics, which made her precisely the kind of person the Human Interstellar Engagement Office believed was appropriate for conclave diplomacy. She had short hair she kept meaning to grow out, a habit of chewing the inside of her cheek when she was thinking hard, and a laugh that several conclave members had described in their private logs as alarming in its suddenness. She had been on Velsorith for 8 months. In those 8 months she had done the following. She had reorganized the communal meal rotation in the observer quarters after noticing that 3 different species were scheduling eating periods at conflicting times and creating a bottleneck at the nutrient dispensers. Nobody had asked her to do this. The scheduling conflict had existed for 200 years. It was resolved in 4 days. She had, during a conclave recess, wandered into the station's lower maintenance corridors, not prohibited simply because no one had ever thought to go there voluntarily, and spent 6 hours mapping the station's secondary coolant routing, which she then presented to the station overseer as a personal project. The overseer, a slow and deeply dignified species called a fel, had stared at the map for a long time before asking why she had done this. Claire had shrugged and said she liked knowing how things worked. The fel had not known what to do with that answer and had filed it under a category they privately labeled human behavior. Unexplained, non-threatening probably. She had also, in her 3rd month, asked the conclave's head of xenobiological records whether she could read the full archive of extinct civilization files. When asked why, she had said, "I want to know what mistakes look like from the outside." The head of records, a creature called a suran who communicated through patterns of light pulsing beneath their translucent skin, had flickered in a sequence that translated roughly as deep, involuntary discomfort before granting the request. Claire had read 2,200 files. She had taken notes. She had asked 17 follow-up questions. She had then gone very quiet for approximately 2 weeks, which her colleague delegate Huang Bo had recognized as the particular silence of someone who had learned something they were still figuring out how to carry. It was during that quiet period that the crisis began. Not a war. Not an invasion. Not the kind of crisis the conclave had protocols for. The crisis was this: the Vel Nurith were dying. The Vel Nurith were one of the conclave's founding species, one of the original 7 civilizations that had come together 9,000 years ago to establish the framework of interstellar cooperation that had, more or less, kept the known galaxy from tearing itself apart. They were ancient. They were respected. They communicated through a combination of subsonic vibration and precise geometric body positioning that had taken other species centuries to fully decode. They were also, quietly, desperately, and with great dignity, going extinct. Not from violence. Not from disease. From something that had no easy name. Their birth rate had been declining for 800 years. Not catastrophically, just steadily, like water dropping 1 degree at a time. Their population, once in the billions, was now measured in the low millions. Their home system had 3 worlds and 2 of them were nearly empty. Their young, what few were born, showed less and less of the deep cultural memory that Vel Nurith society depended upon. The connection between generations was thinning. Their elders could feel it happening and could not explain it and could not stop it, and that inability was, for a species defined by its depth of continuity, a wound that had no bandage. The conclave had been trying to help for 300 years. They had offered genetic stabilization programs. Vel Nurith had declined, not from pride, but from a genuine philosophical position that intervention in biological continuity was a form of lying to the future. They had offered cultural preservation frameworks. The Vel Nurith had accepted these with grace and used them carefully and still declined in ways that made the frameworks feel like photographs of something that was already gone. They had offered habitation support, resource allocation, population distribution modeling. The Vel Nurith had engaged with all of it thoughtfully and thanked the conclave deeply and continued, slowly and quietly, to disappear. The conclave did not know what else to do. And then Claire Vasquez came out of her 2 weeks of silence, knocked on the door of Tethasalun's archive and said, "I've been reading the extinction files. I think I know what's happening to the Vel Nurith. I'm probably wrong. But I'd like to talk to them." Tethasalun studied Claire for a long moment. This was not unusual. Delvari studied everything for long moments. Their eyes, 4 of them set in a slow arc across the upper portion of their hollow faces, did not move quickly. They tracked things the way a tide tracks, which is to say, gradually, completely, and with a sense that eventually everything would be covered. "You have read 2,200 extinction files," Tethasalun said. Her voice resonated through the room at a low frequency that Claire's ears processed as speech but her sternum processed as something more like weather. "In how many standard days?" 14, Claire said. "That is," Tethasalun paused. "That is not a medically advisable pace." "I know. My sleep was bad." Claire sat down in the chair she had taken to using across from Tethasalun's desk. Nobody had given her the chair, but nobody had removed it either, and Claire operated in that particular zone of permission that was defined by the absence of prohibition. But I kept noticing something. Across a lot of the files. Not all of them. Maybe a third. What did you notice? A pattern in how civilizations describe the last few centuries before they go quiet. Claire pulled a small notation device from her jacket pocket. She had filled it, Tethys knew, with thousands of compressed notes. It's not starvation. It's not war. It's not even disease most of the time. It's something the files keep describing in different ways but that keeps meaning the same thing. Which is, the future stops feeling real to them. Tethys resonance chambers produced a single low tone. Explain. Okay. Claire leaned forward, elbows on knees, the posture of someone who has been rehearsing this explanation in the shower. When a civilization reaches a certain age, and it seems to happen at different ages for different species, but it happens, they accumulate so much history that the history starts to outweigh the future in how they think. Not philosophically, neurologically, culturally. However it works for that species. The past becomes more present than the present. Every decision gets filtered through what came before. Every new thing gets evaluated against everything that already happened. This seems like wisdom. It is wisdom. It's genuine wisdom. I'm not saying it's wrong. Claire paused. But there's a cost. When the past outweighs the future in your cognitive architecture, when your entire cultural nervous system is oriented backward, why have children stops being an obvious answer? Because children are futures. Children are continuation. Children are the argument that tomorrow matters as much as yesterday. And if you can't feel that anymore, if tomorrow feels theoretical and yesterday feels real, then the impulse fades. Not from sadness. Not from despair. Just from a kind of gravitational pull. The past has more mass. You fall toward it. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the archive's single narrow viewport, the dark between stars sat exactly as it always sat, patient, absolute, indifferent to small conversations in small rooms about large endings. The Vel Nurith, Tethys said slowly, are one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in known record. Yes. Their culture is defined by the preservation and transmission of accumulated memory across generations. Yes. Their very identity is structured around continuity with the past. Yes. Claire's voice was quiet. They built the most beautiful backward-looking culture in the galaxy. And I think it's exactly what's pulling them under. Not because it's bad. Because it worked too well. Tethys looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "Why do you want to talk to them?" "Because I don't think any of the Conclave's interventions ever addressed this. They addressed symptoms. Resources, genetics, habitat. The things you can measure and redistribute." Claire set her notation device on the edge of the desk. Nobody ever sat with a Vel Nurith elder and said, "I think you've stopped believing in your own future. And I think I might understand why." Not to fix it. Just to say it out loud to someone who doesn't already know. "You believe speaking the thing aloud has value?" "I believe being witnessed has value," Claire said. "Especially by someone who arrived from outside the weight of it. Someone who doesn't carry the same gravity." Tethys was quiet for a very long time after that. Then she reached across her desk, picked up Suveth Karn's warning and held it up to the light. "I do not have a word for it. I'm not certain one exists. I will arrange the introduction," she said. The Vel Nurith elder's name, in the closest phonetic approximation that human vocal anatomy could manage, was Orith von Thessis. Though she had told Claire, through the station's translation system, that the name was really a geometric shape, and that speaking it in a straight line of syllables was like trying to describe a sphere by listing its points one at a time. "You can call me Orith," she had said, with the gentle resignation of someone who had made this concession 10,000 times. "It is the beginning of the shape. It will do." Orith was old. Even by Vel Nurith standards, a species whose elders commonly lived for 400 years, she was old. She stood at just under 2 meters, her body composed of layered segments that moved with a slow, tidal grace, each segment slightly translucent at its edges so that in certain light she appeared to be made of stacked pieces of pale amber glass. Her 4 lower limbs planted firmly on the floor at all times. Her upper body could rotate a full 360 degrees, which Claire had learned not to flinch at after the third conversation. They met in a room near the station's long observation gallery, which overlooked the slowly drifting dark. Neither of them had suggested this room. They had both arrived at it independently on different paths and found each other there, which felt like something but neither of them said so. The translation system handled their words with a 2-second delay, converting Claire's voice into subsonic pattern tone and converting Oritha's body geometry into English. It was not a perfect system. There were concepts on both sides that arrived slightly wrong, like a word in one language that exists untranslated into another, the meaning present but the landing point missing. "You have read about my people," Orith said. Her upper body had rotated slightly to orient toward Claire. This, the translation notes explained, was a gesture of full attention. More costly than it appeared because Vel Nurith elders did not give full attention lightly. "I've read what the archive has," Claire said. "I know that's not the same as knowing your people." "No," Orith agreed. "But it is more than most have done. I also read the files on what the Conclave has tried." "Yes." Oritha's segmented body shifted in a slow way that the translator annotated as Rai, a notation that struck Claire as deeply, unexpectedly moving, that a translation system old enough to have catalogued a dying civilization had developed a label for its particular kind of dark humor. "They have been very thorough. Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "And can you tell me if the question is wrong, not just if the answer is no but if the question itself is pointed in the wrong direction?" Oritha's rotation stilled. "That is a careful way to ask for permission. I've been learning that questions can do damage before you even get to the answer." "Yes," Orith said. "They can." She settled. "Ask." Claire looked out at the dark for a moment first. "When you imagine the future of your people," she said, "what does it look like?" The translation delay ran its 2 seconds. Then it ran 2 more. Then Orith said very quietly, "I do not imagine it." "Why not?" "Because," she paused. The translator flickered, indicating a long internal search for the right geometry to encode. "Because imagining it requires believing it will be different from now. And now is so full. So heavy. Every moment I exist in, I can feel the 9,000 years behind it. Every choice I consider, I feel it echo against every choice my ancestors made in the same direction." A slow rotation. "It is not grief. I want you to understand that. It is not sadness. The past is not painful. It is present. It is here with me at all times. My ancestors are not memory. They are company. And when your company is that vast." "The room is already full," Claire said softly. A long pause. "Yes," Orith said. "That is," the translator flickered again. "That is the closest any non-Vel Nurith has ever come." They sat with that for a while. Outside, the dark between stars did what it always did. Nothing, completely and with perfect consistency. Then Claire said, "I want to tell you something about my species. Not to compare. Not to suggest it means anything for yours. Just because I think you've been carrying something alone for a very long time and I'd like to sit on the other side of it." "Speak," Orith said. "Humans forget things constantly," Claire said. "Not just facts. We forget feelings. We forget what it was like to be a previous version of ourselves. We lose our own past regularly and completely. It used to embarrass us, this leakiness, this inability to hold what we'd been. We built systems to compensate. Writing, recording, archiving. We spent thousands of years trying to become more like you. Trying to keep everything. And we never quite managed it. The leakiness stayed. And we, most of us most of the time, stopped seeing it as a failure." She paused. "Because the forgetting is also the thing that lets us believe in tomorrow. If I carried every version of myself at full weight all the time, the way you carry your ancestors, I don't think I could move. I don't think I could imagine anything new. The lightness isn't just loss. It's also propulsion." Orith was still for a very long time. "You are saying," she said at last, "that your species' great failure is what allows your great restlessness." "I'm saying maybe they're the same thing," Claire said. "And maybe neither of ours is wrong. Just pulling in different directions. Yours toward depth. Ours toward distance." Another long silence. Then Orith said something that the translation system rendered as a single word, but flagged with an annotation that said, "Vel Nurith, no direct equivalent, nearest meaning, the specific feeling of being understood by someone who cannot fully understand you, and finding that this is enough." Claire read the annotation. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Word traveled on Vel Sorith the way rumors travel in quiet places, not quickly but thoroughly. Within a week of Claire's first conversation with Orith, there were 7 separate internal memos circulating among Conclave members about what had happened in the observation gallery. The memos were careful and measured, written by people who were professionally required to be careful and measured, but there was a quality to them, an undertone, a certain tightness in the phrasing, that Tethys Saloon recognized as the written equivalent of holding your breath. The conclave was unsettled. Not by anything Claire had done wrong. That was the part that was hardest for them to process. She had done nothing wrong. She had sat with an elder of a dying species and had a conversation. She had not violated protocol because there was no protocol for the thing she had done. She had not overstepped because no boundary had been drawn in that particular space. She had found, as Claire Vasquez consistently found, a gap in the existing structure and had simply walked through it. The conclave convened an informal session. Informal sessions were technically called information-sharing forums, a name chosen centuries ago specifically because emergency meetings sounded alarmist and the conclave was constitutionally opposed to alarmism. 17 senior delegates attended. Delegate Musath of the Fel opened the session by standing very still for 45 seconds, which was their species' way of indicating that what was about to be said was being said with great care. The human delegate has been speaking with Elder Orith von Thessis, Musath said. She has been speaking with her about the nature of Vel Nuruth cultural decline. She has offered not solutions, not interventions, what the translator logs describe as perspective from outside the gravity. Delegate Ein-2 of the Sioux Ran pulsed a rapid-fire sequence beneath their skin that translated as, "This is unprecedented." "It is also unscheduled," said Delegate Vorth of the Chathi, a species of slight, bird-like creatures who communicated largely through the precise angle of their wing feathers and who were, culturally, extremely committed to things happening at scheduled times and in scheduled ways. Vortha's wings were held at approximately 40 degrees from horizontal, which indicated formal concern. The human was not given a mandate to engage with the Vel Nuruth on this matter. She was not prohibited, Tethasalun said. She had come to the session uninvited, which was technically permitted but rarely done. Several delegates looked at her with the various physiological equivalents of raised eyebrows. "I want to point that out clearly. She found a space where nothing was written and she acted in it. This is not a violation. It is she paused. "A characteristic," said Delegate Musath quietly. "Yes," Tethasalun said. "A characteristic." "The question," said Delegate Ein-2, shifting to a slower pulse pattern, "is not whether she violated protocol. The question is what she is doing. What the shape of it is. We have observed her for 8 months and we have accumulated many data points, but they do not, a long light pattern pause. They do not resolve into a familiar silhouette." "She reorganized our meal schedule," said one of the junior delegates. "Yes," said Ein-2. "She mapped the coolant corridors." "Yes." "She read 2,200 extinction files." "Yes." "And now she is sitting with a dying elder and telling her about human forgetting." "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment. "Is she," said Delegate Vorth, wings adjusting, "trying to fix them?" Tethasalun thought about this carefully. "No," she said finally. "I do not believe that is the right word for it. Fixing implies a belief that she knows the correct outcome. I do not think she knows the correct outcome. I think she is doing something different." She paused again, working through it in real time. "I think she is trying to add herself to the equation. Not as a solution. As a variable. She wants to change what is possible by being present in a way that was not present before." Another silence. Delegate Musath stood very still again. Then they said, "Savath Karn filed a warning 11,000 years ago. The room temperature did not change. The lighting did not change. But something shifted in the way everyone in the room was breathing. A collective microadjustment, the physiological equivalent of 20 people simultaneously deciding to pay closer attention." "I know," said Tethasalun. "I keep it on my desk." "She said they would do something stranger and harder to recover from than conquest," Musath said. "She said she did not have a word for it." "Yes." Musath looked at the archivist with all the patience of a species that processed time like weather. "Do you have a word for it yet?" Tethasalun thought about Claire Vasquez mapping coolant corridors nobody had asked her to map. She thought about her reading 2,200 extinction files in 14 days because she wanted to know what mistakes looked like from the outside. She thought about her sitting in the observation gallery and saying the room is already full to an elder who had never been understood by anyone outside her own species. "No," Tethasalun said. "But I am beginning to think it is not a threat." She paused. "I am not yet certain what it is instead." There were 4 of them. For Vel Nuruth young, not children exactly, the developmental stages did not map cleanly onto human categories, but they were among the youngest generation, the ones who had been born into a world where the elders already outnumbered the young by ratios that had no historical precedent in Vel Nuruth memory. They were uncertain creatures as uncertain young tend to be, but their uncertainty had an additional layer, They had grown up knowing they were the last of something. Not told explicitly, the elders were too careful, too loving for that, but knowing nonetheless, the way you know things that are in the air and the water and the specific quality of silence that falls when adults stop mid-conversation as you enter the room. Their names in straight-line phonetics: Essel, Vaun, Theris, and the youngest, who had not yet settled on a name shape and went by a placeholder sound that the translators rendered as Cathis for convenience. Orith gathered them in her quarters 3 days after her first conversation with Claire. Her quarters on Vel Sorith were spare by most species standards. The Vel Nurith traveled with very little because their richness was internal. One curved bench. A shallow bowl of something that functioned approximately like ambient scent. And on every surface, arranged with the precision of long habit, small crystalline objects that were not decorative. They were anchors, physical objects linked to memories the way a string links a kite to a hand. Every elder carried them. The young rarely needed them yet. The memories weren't heavy enough. Orith sat before her four and rotated slowly to face each of them in turn, which they understood as the full attention gesture and straightened accordingly. "I want to tell you about a human," she said. Essel, the oldest of the four, moved in a way that indicated polite skepticism. She had been briefed on the human observer. Most of the young had been. "She is strange," Orith said preemptively. "That is not in dispute." A slow rotation. "But strange in a way I want you to think about." She told them what Claire had said. About the forgetting. About the leakiness. About propulsion and depth and pulling in different directions. She told it carefully without editorializing, because the gift a good storyteller gives is the room to draw your own conclusion. When she finished, Cathis, the youngest, the one still without a settled name, made a small movement that the others recognized as a question forming slowly. "Did it?" Cathis began. Stopped. Started again. "Did it help?" What she said. Orith considered this honestly. "It did not change anything that is true," she said. "We are still what we are. The weight is still the weight. But," she paused, and her translator would later render the pause as significant. "There is a thing that happens when you have carried something for so long that you have forgotten it is a thing you are carrying. It has simply become your shape. The weight has become your posture." She rotated toward Cathis specifically. "And then someone who does not share your shape looks at you and says, 'I see what you are holding.' And the weight does not leave. But it becomes distinct. Separate from you. A thing you carry rather than a thing you are." Silence. "And that matters?" Vaun asked. "Enormously," Orith said. Another silence. "Why did she do it?" Theris asked. "The human. Why did she come to you?" "She has no obligation to our people." Orith thought about this. She thought about it the way she thought about things that mattered. Slowly, from all sides, in the full company of her ancestors. "I asked her that," she said finally. "In our second conversation. I asked her why she was spending her time on an old dying species when she had the entire living galaxy to involve herself in. What did she say?" "She said," Orith paused, and in the pause her resonance body shifted in a way that her grandchildren recognized as the gesture for something I will need to carry for a long time. "She said, because you were warned about. 11,000 years ago, someone looked at my species and filed a warning. They were not wrong to worry. We are a lot. We come in and rearrange everything, not always with permission, not always with wisdom. And I can't undo that. I can't make us less than what we are." A slow, full rotation. And then she said, "But I can make sure that wherever we arrive, something is better for us having been there. Not fixed. Not saved. Just more seen. I would like you to be more seen." The four young Vel Nurith were still for a long time after that. Cathis, the one without a name, was the first to move. A small, precise movement. A fold of the upper segments that the older ones didn't recognize immediately, because it was not drawn from any traditional Vel Nurith vocabulary of gesture. It was something new. "What was that?" Essel asked. Cathis held the shape for a moment, testing it. "I don't know yet," Cathis said. "I'm making it up." 3 months passed. Claire continued her work as an observer delegate, the official duties that involved attending conclave sessions, filing reports, answering correspondence from the Interstellar Engagement Office, and generally representing humanity in the slow, careful, protocol-heavy way that interstellar diplomacy required. She was good at the official duties. She was also transparently much more interested in everything else. She had, in those 3 months, done the following additional unrequested things. She had noticed that the Suran delegates were experiencing a pattern of decision fatigue in afternoon sessions. Their light pulse communication became slower and less precise after the 3rd hour, and had submitted an informal suggestion that major votes be scheduled before the midpoint of the standard session. This had been ignored by the conclave scheduling committee, then independently rediscovered by a Suran delegate, then quietly implemented as though it had always been planned. She had begun learning the geometric basics of Vel-Nuruth body language. Not fluently, the physiology was simply too different for a human to replicate, but enough to recognize the major registers of meaning. She could now tell, when sitting across from a Vel-Nuruth, whether she was in a space of full attention, partial attention, formal address, or private thought. This was, by the assessment of the station's xenolinguistics team, something that typically required 3 years of dedicated study. She had managed approximate functional literacy in 4 months because she had, as she explained to a baffled researcher, been paying attention during all the parts where nothing was officially happening. She had also, quietly and without announcement, begun spending an hour each week in the archive with Tetha Saloon. Not always working. Sometimes sitting. The Delvari did not require conversation, and Claire had learned to be comfortable in the particular silence of a being for whom stillness was not emptiness. During one of these silences, Tetha Saloon had said, "I have been studying Savath Karn's notes." Not the warning. The full research record. 47 years of observation. And? Claire said. She was watching your species for signs of the specific behaviors that destroyed the civilizations in the archive. She was looking for patterns of expansion, resource consumption, ideological propagation. The standard threat matrix. Makes sense. Yes. But what she kept writing in her margins, not in the report, in the private research notes, was something different. Tetha Saloon held the reading plate at the correct angle. She kept writing, "They seem to be looking for something." Over and over. Different phrasing each time but the same center. They seem to be looking for something. I cannot identify what. Neither, I suspect, can they. Claire was quiet for a moment. What do you think she meant? I think, Tetha Saloon said slowly, she meant that your species has an orientation that she could not classify. Most civilizations she had studied had clear centers of gravity, survival, expansion, legacy, transcendence. Definable goals that shaped their trajectory. Your species has, a directionality without a fixed destination. She could see the reaching and could not find the target. Maybe there isn't one, Claire said. Is that comforting or terrifying? Claire thought about it. Both, she said. Mostly both. Tetha Saloon set down the reading plate. There is a concept in Delvari philosophy, she said. Very old. Rarely used anymore because it describes something we mostly believed was specific to certain physical phenomena. It translates, approximately, as the thing that changes its container by passing through it. She paused. Water through stone. Light through crystal. Pressure through membrane. The container is altered. The passing thing continues. You think that's what we are, Claire said. I think that is the closest word I have found, Tetha Saloon said. It is not conquest. It is not saving. It is not even influence in the way we usually mean. It is, she paused. It is the kind of presence that leaves everything it touches different. Change. Not better or worse by any single standard. Just, permanently, irreversibly other than it was. Silence. That should be terrifying, Claire said. Yes, Tetha Saloon agreed. Is it? Another long Delvari pause. Less than it was, the archivist said. Considerably less than it was. Cathis had been developing a vocabulary of new gestures for weeks. Not in secret. Secrecy was not a concept that mapped cleanly onto Vel-Nuruth culture, but in the private way of someone testing weight before committing. Each new gesture was small. A fold here. An angle of the upper segments there. A way of holding the lower body that didn't come from any ancestral grammar. The other young watched with a mixture of uncertainty and something that was, very quietly, the opposite of uncertainty. When Cathis asked to meet with Claire, Orith accompanied but sat back, which the young understood as, I am here. This is yours. Claire had come to these meetings as she came to most things, without a prepared agenda, with a notation device, and with the particular quality of attention that the Vel-Nuruth had taken to describing among themselves as full-body listening, because unlike most species, Claire appeared to involve her whole physical presence in hearing. She leaned forward. Her hands went still. Her eyes stopped moving and fixed. Cathis began with a gesture, one of the new ones, that held a shape for a moment before releasing it. What does that mean? Claire asked. It means, Cathis paused. It means the future that has not been felt yet. Different from the future that hasn't happened. Something cannot have happened but still feel real. We have many words for that. This is for the future that has not been felt. That exists in thought but not in the body. Did you make that up? Yes. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, does your language have that word? Did it before? No, Cathis said. It had near words. Words for anticipated grief. Words for imagined futures that would never come. But not, the gesture again held longer. Not for the future that waits to be felt. That is not yet real but could become real. The gap between knowing something and believing it. Why did you need a word for that? Cathis's segmented body shifted in a way that Orith recognized, with a private, quiet, enormous feeling, as the gesture her grandchild made when about to say something true. Because, Cathis said, I had that feeling. And I had no word for it. And I needed a word for it so I could tell myself it existed. Claire did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, what does it feel like? The thing the word is for. Cathis thought carefully. Like standing at the edge of water, Cathis said finally. Not in it. Not away from it. At the edge. The water is real. You can see it. You can feel the temperature of the air above it. But you have not yet decided to go in. And the moment before you decide, the gesture one more time. That exact moment. I lived in that moment for a very long time. I thought it was an empty place. A place of waiting. But it is not empty. What is it? It is where the future lives, Cathis said, before you let it in. In her report to the Interstellar Engagement Office that night, Claire wrote many things about conclave proceedings and observer protocols and the administrative details that the office needed and expected. At the very end, after the official content, she wrote one personal note that she marked as non-essential, the way she marked all the things that were most essential. One of the Vel Nurith Young invented a new word today. For something their language didn't have before. I don't know what that means yet, statistically or culturally or scientifically. But I know what it means in the room. It means someone who had stopped believing in their own future has started building a vocabulary for it. They're making the infrastructure for a thing they haven't let themselves feel yet. That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. I don't know what happens next. But something is different now. Something passed through something else and left it changed. Why I need to think about this for a long time. She sent the report. Then she sat at her small desk in the observer quarters and looked out at the dark between stars for a while. It was the same dark it had always been. It looked different anyway. The session had been called formally this time. Not an information-sharing forum. An actual session. Agenda Item 4. Vel Nurith Cultural Continuity, Assessment of Current Intervention Outcomes and Future Strategic Direction. Which was conclave language for, something is happening and we need to decide how to feel about it officially. Claire attended as an observer, which meant she sat in the gallery above the main floor, a beautiful carved sweep of pale stone that curved around the chamber like a parenthesis, and watched without speaking. This was technically her role at all formal sessions. She had learned to be comfortable with it in the way you learn to be comfortable with anything you have no power to change, completely and without pretending it was a preference. Below her, 17 delegates arranged themselves in the session configuration, a large, slightly irregular oval that had been the conclave's traditional seating formation for 9,000 years. Each position in the oval had history attached to it. You could read the political archaeology of the galaxy just from knowing who sat where. The Vel Nurith position, there were 2 seats for a species that had once sent 12 delegates and now sent 2, was occupied by a senior diplomat named Erwin Veth and unusually by the young Cathis, who had been brought as an observer participant at Oritha's quiet insistence. Cathis sat very still and held the new gestures close, private, not performing them. Delegate Musath of the Fel opened. Over the past 4 months, Musath said, with a particular carefully weighted slowness that indicated high official gravity, the human observer delegate has engaged in 17 documented interactions with Vel Nurith individuals on Vel Sorith Station. These interactions were not mandated, not prohibited, and not coordinated with any conclave body. They were conducted in what the human describes as a very slight pause. Personal initiative. Delegate Vorth of the Chathi, Wings at Formal Concern Angle. Is personal initiative a category our framework accommodates? It is not a category our framework has previously needed to accommodate, Musath said. Then we have a structural gap. We have many structural gaps, said Tethasalun, from a position at the edge of the session floor where archivists were permitted to stand, though rarely did. This particular gap has existed for 9,000 years. We have simply never had a species present that moved through gaps as a primary navigation strategy. Vortha's wings adjusted. You are describing a fundamental incompatibility between human behavioral patterns and conclave operational structure. I am describing a fundamental difference, Tethasalun said carefully. Incompatibility is a conclusion. I am not ready to draw that conclusion. Delegate Ainta pulsed slowly. What outcome has the human's engagement produced, concretely? Delegate Erwin Veth of the Vel Nurith had been still throughout, in the formal posture of a diplomat. Now they moved. It was a small movement, a rotation of the upper body. But it was a rotation specifically directed at Aintu, and in the session space, that carried enormous formal weight. I will speak to that, Erwin Veth said. The room settled. 3 weeks ago, Erwin Veth said, the first new Vel Nurith birth in 7 years was registered in our home system. We do not attribute causation to any single factor. Our people are too careful for that and the situation is too complex. But the family of the newborn sent a communication to Vel Sorith, to Elder Orith von Thessis, pause, and to the human delegate. A silence in the chamber. They said, Erwin Veth continued, that they did not know why things felt different. They said they had not changed their beliefs or their philosophy. The weight of the ancestors was still present, still real, still with them. But something had shifted in how they related to the future. They described it as a slight tilt of the body, as no longer being afraid of the future's emptiness, because they had been reminded that emptiness is also another word for space. The chamber was very quiet. In the gallery above, Claire had stopped chewing the inside of her cheek, a habit she had when thinking hard, and was very still. Space, she thought. Not nothing. Space. This is one birth, Delegate Vorth said carefully. One family. We should not. No, Erwin Veth agreed immediately. We should not draw large conclusions from small data. We are Vel Nurith. We are constitutionally opposed to small data. The rotation deepened, a gesture the translation system annotated as something in the vicinity of dark humor. But we are also constitutionally required to notice a thing when it is happening. And something is happening. Musath stood very still for a long time. Then they said, the question before this body is how to formally respond to the human delegate's engagement with the Vel Nurith situation. Vorth, we should establish a protocol. Tethasalun, what protocol would you write for this? Vorth, a protocol that, a pause. Feathers settling. A protocol that. The pause extended. Everyone in the room knew the pause was because the protocol was, genuinely, impossible to write. How do you write a protocol for presence? For the specific quality of attention Claire had brought to a dying elder and 4 uncertain young? For sitting in the observation gallery and finding the right words for something nobody had named? Caro, said Erwin Veth, a Vel Nurith word that the translator had never had to use in a formal session before, because it was not a formal word. It was, approximately, a word for enough. Now the point has been reached. Let us not write a protocol that turns something living into something filed. The chamber was quiet. Then, from the gallery, without being called upon, without a mandate, without anything except the particular restlessness of a species that found gaps and walked through them, Claire Vesquez leaned forward over the carved stone railing and said, loudly enough to be heard, I have a suggestion. If it's appropriate for an observer to make one. Every face in the chamber turned up toward her. Give the Vel Nurith a seat on the strategic planning body, she said. Not a courtesy seat. A real one. With full voting weight on decisions about long-term conclave direction. Pause. Because the thing I noticed, reading 2,200 extinction files, is that the species that disappeared mostly disappeared because the living galaxy stopped organizing itself around their continued existence. Not from malice. Just from momentum. Things moved on. And they were left in the archive. She looked around the chamber. You've been trying to help them survive. That's different from deciding their existence matters to the future in a structural way. Make them part of building what comes next. Give the weight of their past somewhere to go that isn't just inward. Silence. Then Delegate Ainta pulsed a sequence that translated, slowly, as, this is not in the agenda. No, Claire agreed from the gallery. It isn't. Tethasalun spent 2 days pulling every reference in the archive to Vel Nurith participation in conclave governance. What she found was not surprising once she was looking at it clearly. What surprised her was that it had taken so long to look. The Vel Nurith had been present at the conclave's founding. They were one of the original 7. Their philosophical framework, specifically, the idea that civilizations owed responsibility to the civilizations that came after them, not just the ones that came before, was embedded in the conclave's foundational documents so deeply that most members didn't know it had originated with the Vel Nurith at all. It had simply become the way things were. Background. Infrastructure. And over 9,000 years, as the Vel Nurith population declined and their delegation shrank and their voice in proceedings grew quieter, the conclave had adapted its administrative structures, its voting weights, its strategic planning bodies, in ways that slowly, unconsciously, marginalized the very philosophical foundation they had been built on. Not maliciously. Not even negligently, exactly. Just the way living systems adapt. Moving toward what was growing, away from what was receding. Optimizing for the present without noticing the cost being levied on continuity. Tethasalun wrote a 40-page report. She wrote it in her own voice, not the careful official voice of an archivist. She wrote it the way Savathkarn had written that final paragraph 11,000 years ago, not as a filing but as a thing that needed to be said out loud. She titled it, On What We Built Ourselves Upon and Then Forgot. She sent it to every delegate on Vel Sorith. She sent a copy to Claire. She sent a copy to Caithus. Then she went back to her desk and sat with Savathkarn's warning and read the last paragraph again. They will come. Not because they need to. Not because we have something they require. They will come because they have already done everything else within reach, and we are next on the list of things they have not yet done. When they arrive, they will not conquer us. Conquest is too simple for what they are. They will do something stranger and harder to recover from. I do not have a word for it. I'm not certain one exists. She put it down. She picked up her stylus and, on the physical reading plate, in the margin next to Savathkarn's last paragraph, carefully, in the small precise strokes of a Delvari who had spent her life in the company of language, she wrote 2 words. Not the Delvari concept. Not the translation. 2 new words in a language she was still learning to inhabit. Witnessed. Present. She looked at them for a long time. Then she wrote a 3rd. Enough. The Vel Nurith strategic planning seat was approved in a formal session 6 weeks later. Not unanimously. Delegate Vorth voted against on grounds of procedural irregularity, and filed a formal dissent that was thorough and well-reasoned and will be taught in conclave administrative courses for centuries as an example of technically correct objection to something that happened anyway. 3 other delegates abstained for various reasons. The motion passed with a margin that was comfortable but not overwhelming, the kind of margin that means this was real, not the kind that means everyone agreed. Erwin Veth accepted the seat with a speech that was, by the translation system's annotation, simultaneously one of the most formally dignified and privately joyful addresses ever recorded in a conclave session. The joy was internal. The dignity was external. But those who could read the body language subtleties saw both. Caithus was not at the session. Caithus had, 2 days prior, boarded a transport back to the Vel Nurith home system. The first time in years that a young Vel Nurith had voluntarily chosen to go home rather than to one of the outer stations. Before leaving, Caithus had met with Claire one final time. It was a short meeting. The kind of meeting that exists not to convey information but to acknowledge something before it gets too large to acknowledge in any individual moment. Caithus had given Claire a small crystalline object, an anchor, the kind the elders carried. Not linked to a Vel Nurith memory. Blank. Empty of history. For you to put something in, Caithus had said. Claire had held it carefully. It was lighter than it looked. I don't know if this will work the way you want it to, she had said honestly. I don't know if I can fill this the right way. I forget things. My species is leaky. Yes, Caithus had said. But you were here. That is already in it. And then Caithus had given a gesture, the newest one, the one that meant the future that has not been felt yet, and held it for a moment, and then added a second movement to it that Claire had not seen before. What's the second part? Claire asked. Caithus held the combined shape. The first part is the future waiting to be felt, Caithus said. The second part, a pause, a settling, a young creature finding the weight of something new and deciding to pick it up anyway. The second part is deciding to feel it. Claire watched the shape for a long time. Then she said, Does it have a name? The whole thing. Caithus had thought about this for a moment. Not yet, Caithus had said. But I am working on it. 2 years later. The Vel Nurith seat on the strategic planning body had, in its first year, produced 4 recommendations that were adopted. 3 were minor, adjustments to resource allocation protocols, a refinement of the long-term cultural preservation framework, a structural change to how species applied for conclave membership that made the process less inadvertently hostile to older or slower-moving civilizations. The 4th was not minor. The 4th was a proposal, drafted by Erwin Veth in consultation with Orith von Thessis and 2 of the other Vel Nurith elders, To establish within the conclave a permanent archive body dedicated specifically to living civilizations in transition. Not extinct civilizations. Not historical record. Living, present, breathing species who were changing in ways that didn't fit existing categories. Species who existed in the gaps between definitions. The proposal called this body the Seventh Office, after an archivist who had filed a warning 11,000 years ago and had the intellectual honesty to admit she didn't have the right word for what she was observing. Tethasalun had been named its first director before she even knew it was being proposed. She had stood in Erwin-Vetha's office and read the proposal twice and then said, with the particular Delvari stillness of very deep feeling, Savath Karn would have found this profoundly ironic. Yes, Erwin-Veth had agreed. She filed the warning about humans. And we are naming the office for observing things that don't fit categories after her. Because a human arrived and did not fit categories. Yes, Erwin-Veth said again. And the office will exist to watch other such things. To notice them before they have to be warned about. To see them before they are lost or feared or missed. Yes. Tethasalun had looked at the proposal for a long time. Then she said, "What do we name the human? In the founding documents. How do we describe what she did?" Erwin-Veth was quiet for a moment. Cathis sent a communication last week. They said. The new word is finished. For the gesture? For the gesture. For what the gesture means. For the thing Claire Vasquez came to Velsorith and did, which is not saving and not fixing and not conquering and not any of the things the warning was worried about. Erwin-Vetha's body settled into a posture that the translator, after a moment's processing, rendered as something in the vicinity of peace. The word is new. It has no history yet. Cathis says that is appropriate, that the best words for new things should arrive without the weight of previous uses. They should be light enough to travel. What is the word? Erwin-Veth made the gesture, both parts together, the future waiting and the decision to feel it. Then they spoke the word. The translator took longer than usual. Then it rendered, Vel Nurith, no established equivalent, new term proposed by Cathis named meaning, the act of arriving in a space that did not know it needed you, and remaining long enough to become part of what that space believes is possible. Tethasalun read it twice. Then she went back to her archive. She placed Savath Karn's warning in the center of her desk, where she had kept it for years. She placed the blank crystal anchor Cathis had given Claire, and which Claire had brought to her for safekeeping with a note that said, I don't have a good place for fragile things. Please keep this somewhere it won't get lost. In the upper left corner. She placed her own two-word notation, witnessed. Present. Enough. On the right. And in the center, next to the warning, she placed a new card. On it she wrote the Vel Nurith word, in the original geometry as a shape rather than a line of syllables. And underneath, in every language she knew. This is what was coming. This is what arrived. This is what it was called in the end. Part 12, what Claire found in her pocket. She was packing to return to Earth. Not permanently, her rotation was ending, a new delegate would arrive, and she would go home for 8 months before the next cycle brought her back. Standard procedure. She had done it twice before. It was the kind of departure that was not quite goodbye because the returning was already scheduled, and yet still felt like crossing something. She was folding her third-to-last shirt when she found the note. It was in the pocket of her jacket, the same jacket she had been wearing when she sat in the observation gallery for the first time and decided, without a clear reason and with full certainty, to knock on the door of an archivist and say I've been reading your extinction files and I think I know something. The note was in Tethasalun's handwriting, small, precise in English, which the archivist wrote now with an ease that still surprised Claire. It said, Savath Karn watched your species for 47 years and called you inevitable. She was correct. But she could only see the direction, not the destination. She saw you moving and assumed it was toward something. You are not toward anything. You are the passing through. You are the thing that changes the container. I have kept the archive for 60 years. In that time, I have seen many warnings become losses and many losses become archives and many archives become silence. This is the shape of things. It is not cruel. It is just the shape. But a SYMGHY I have seen one new word invented. One new gesture made for a thing that had no word before. One elder sit in a gallery and feel her weight become distinct from herself. One family have a child because someone reminded them that emptiness is also another word for space. I will not overstate what you did. It is not big enough for the archive of grand things. But it is exactly the right size for the archive I am building. Come back soon. There is a great deal more that does not fit existing categories. T.A. P.S. Cathis has invented 4 more words. I'm writing them down as fast as I can. Claire read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully, smaller than it needed to be, the way you fold things you intend to keep, and put it in the pocket of the shirt she was packing. She zipped her bag. She picked up the bag. She picked up the notation device, still mostly full. She looked around the small room that had been her home for this rotation. The desk, the narrow viewport, the chair nobody had given her and nobody had taken away. She looked at the dark between stars through the viewport. It was the same dark. It looked like space. Not nothing. Space. She shouldered her bag and walked out the door, and the room behind her was different than it had been before she arrived. Not rearranged, not decorated, not fixed, just permanently, quietly, irreversibly other than it would have been without her. As it should be. As it always would be, everywhere she went. Caro, the shape of things was already changing before she noticed it had started, and that was exactly right because the best changes never announce themselves. They simply arrive. And remain. And become part of what the space believes is possible.